In 1963, a 21-year-old boy sat in a doctor's office and heard the words that should have ended his story: "You have 2 years to live." He was sentenced to a prison of bone and nerve, a body that would slowly shut down until he couldn't walk, couldn't write, and eventually, couldn't even speak. But Stephen Hawking didn't die. Instead, he cheated time. While his body remained trapped in a wheelchair, his mind traveled to the very edge of the cosmos, unlocking the secrets of black holes and the Big Bang. He became the most famous scientist of the modern age, proving that while his muscles were weak, his spirit was infinite. This is not just a biography of a physicist. It is the story of the mind that escaped the body. Welcome to EchoLib. If you enjoy audiobooks that expand your mind, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Watched the Stars. If you wanted to find the origins of the mind that would one day decode the universe, you wouldn't look in a high-tech laboratory or a pristine library. You would have to travel back to the 1950s, to a drafty, cluttered house in St. Albans, just north of London. The house was a large, 3-story Victorian wreck that the family had bought cheap because the roof was falling in. It was freezing in the winter, the paint was peeling, and the basement was filled with bees that Stephen's father kept for honey. This was the kingdom of the Hawking family, and to the neighbors, they were baffling. They were an island of eccentricity in a sea of normal, suburban life. The family car was a decommissioned London taxicab that Stephen's father had bought for £50. Inside the house, the furniture was falling apart, but the bookshelves were overflowing. Dinner at the Hawking household was a spectacle of silence. If you were a guest, you might have found it rude. The father, Frank, the mother, Isabel, and the children would sit around the table, eating their food with one hand and holding a book with the other. They didn't make small talk. They consumed knowledge as hungrily as they consumed their dinner. Stephen, born on the 300th anniversary of Galileo's death, fit perfectly into this strange ecosystem. But if you looked at his school reports, you wouldn't have seen a future Nobel-level genius. You would have seen a mess. At St. Albans School, Stephen was not the golden boy. He was the boy with the uniform that was never quite tucked in properly. His handwriting was atrocious, a jagged, illegible scrawl that drove his teachers to despair. In terms of grades, he hovered right in the middle of the class. But grades measure obedience, not intelligence. Outside the classroom, Stephen's peers knew the truth. Among his close circle of friends, he had a nickname that stuck, half in mockery and half in awe. They called him Einstein. They called him this because they saw what he did in his spare time. Stephen wasn't interested in memorizing facts, he was interested in systems. He wanted to know how things worked. One of his most ambitious projects as a teenager was the construction of a computer. This was the 1950s, computers were the size of rooms and cost millions. But Stephen and his best friend decided to build their own. They scavenged parts from old clock mechanisms, a telephone switchboard they found in a junk shop, and recycled wires. Amazingly, it worked. It could perform simple logic calculations. It was the first sign that this boy had the mind of an engineer as much as a physicist. But his mind wasn't just mechanical, it was imaginative. Stephen loved to create worlds. He and his friends invented board games of staggering complexity. They didn't just play simple war games. They created a dynastic game that involved a complete genealogy of royal families, economic systems, and national budgets. Stephen would spend hours calculating the rules, creating a simulation of reality. It was a foreshadowing of his future career. A physicist is, after all, just someone trying to figure out the rules of the biggest game of all, the universe. However, there was a conflict brewing at home. Stephen's father, Frank, was a tropical medicine researcher. He was a practical man who valued biology and medicine. He desperately wanted his eldest son to follow in his footsteps and become a doctor. Stephen refused. He found biology too inexact. It was messy. It was descriptive. Stephen wanted something cleaner. He wanted mathematics. To him, math was the absolute truth. It was the scaffolding of reality. After many arguments, they compromised on physics and chemistry. Stephen would study the laws of nature, not the biology of bodies. It was a choice that would become deeply ironic years later, when his own biology turned against him. In 1959, at the tender age of 17, Stephen headed to Oxford University. He was younger than most of the other students, a skinny boy with a floppy mop of brown hair and a devilish grin. Oxford in the late 50s and early 60s was a unique place. There was a prevailing culture among the elite students that effort was embarrassing. If you had to work hard to get good grades, it meant you were a gray man, boring and average. The ideal was effortless superiority. You were supposed to be brilliant without trying. Stephen Hawking became the king of effortless superiority. He treated his physics degree with a casual arrogance that is almost hard to believe today. He didn't take notes. He rarely visited the library. He later calculated that, during his entire 3 years as an undergraduate at Oxford, he did an average of 1 hour of work per day. One famous story from this time sums up his attitude perfectly. His tutor set the class a series of 13 incredibly difficult physics problems to solve over the week. His classmates spent days sweating over them, managing to solve maybe 1 or 2. Stephen didn't even look at the sheet until the morning the work was due. When he walked into the tutorial, the tutor asked how he had done. Stephen apologized, saying he'd only had time to do the first 10. He hadn't just solved them, he had found errors in the questions themselves. He was operating on a different frequency than everyone else. But to understand what Stephen lost later, we have to look at his body during these Oxford years. He wasn't just a brain in a jar. He was vibrant, active, and loud. Because he was bored by the physics curriculum, Stephen sought excitement elsewhere. He found it on the river. He joined the boat club, the heart of Oxford's social life. Stephen wasn't built to be a rower, he was too slight. So, he became a coxswain. The cox is the person who sits at the very back of the boat, facing forward, steering the rudder and screaming orders at the 8 giant men rowing blindly behind him. It was a role that suited him perfectly. He was the brain, they were the muscle. Stephen became known as a daredevil cox. He would steer the boat through impossibly narrow gaps and take dangerous lines on the river just for the thrill of it, often damaging the boat in the process. This was the Stephen Hawking of the early 1960s, a young man in a blazer and scarf, shouting through a megaphone, drinking beer at the pub, listening to jazz, and dancing at parties. He was popular, witty, and notoriously lazy. He had the world on a string. But as his final year at Oxford approached, 2 things happened. First, the laziness began to catch up with him. He had applied to do his PhD at Cambridge, the most prestigious cosmology center in the world. But to get in, he needed a first-class degree from Oxford, the highest honor. If he got a second-class degree, the offer would be rescinded. As the final exams loomed, Stephen realized he hadn't studied. For the first time in his life, the genius panicked. He spent the night before the finals sleepless and anxious. When he sat for the written papers, he felt he had performed poorly. He had answered only a fraction of the questions, focusing on complex theoretical solutions rather than the standard answers the examiners expected. When the results came back, he was right on the borderline. His score was exactly between a first and a second. To decide his fate, the examiners summoned him for a viva, a live, oral interrogation. He walked into the room to face a panel of stern, intimidating professors. They knew he was brilliant, but they also knew he was lazy. They wanted to see what he was made of. They asked him about his plans. Stephen, 20 years old and nursing a hangover from the night before, looked them in the eye. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He delivered one of the most famous lines in academic history. If you award me a first, he told them, I will go to Cambridge. If you award me a second, I will stay here in Oxford, so I expect you will give me a first. It was a power move. He was effectively telling them that they were the backup plan. The examiners, realizing they were dealing with a mind that was sharper, and more arrogant, than any they had seen in years, gave him the first. He had won. He was off to Cambridge to study the universe. But the second thing that happened during that final year was far more sinister. It started as a whisper. During his last term at Oxford, Stephen noticed he was becoming clumsy. It was nothing dramatic at first. Just small things. He would go to pour a glass of wine and spill it. He would try to tie his shoelace and his fingers wouldn't cooperate. One afternoon, while walking down a flight of stairs in the college dorms, he simply lost his footing. He tumbled all the way to the bottom, hitting his head. He lay there for a moment, stunned, waiting for the pain to fade. He told himself it was just an accident. He was tired. He had been partying too much. He got up, brushed himself off, and kept going. He was 21 years old. He was a first-class graduate of Oxford. He was invincible. He didn't know that the neurons in his spinal cord were already beginning to die. He didn't know that the lazy genius was about to face a challenge that no amount of intelligence could solve. He boarded the train to Cambridge, leaving his youth behind, unaware that the clock was already ticking down to zero. Chapter 2, The Sentence. If Oxford was the endless summer of Stephen Hawking's life, then Cambridge was the immediate, freezing winter. In 1963, he arrived at the university to begin his PhD, armed with his first-class degree, his acceptance letter, and his trademark arrogance. But the clumsiness that had been a joke at Oxford was now becoming a genuine terror. The crisis struck during the Christmas break, just before his new term. Back home in St. Albans, Stephen decided to go ice skating with his mother on a nearby frozen lake. It was a disaster. He fell over and over again, but unlike a child learning to skate, he found he couldn't get back up easily, his legs simply refused to listen. The problem became undeniable at a New Year's party soon after, when his speech slurred so badly that guests assumed he was drunk, though he hadn't touched a drop. His father, Frank, a tropical medicine expert, had been watching his son closely. He saw the stumbling, the difficulty with shoelaces, and the slurred words. The next week, without fanfare, he drove Stephen to a clinic at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. Stephen, just 21 years old, expected a quick checkup and perhaps some vitamins. Instead, he was admitted for 2 weeks of brutal, invasive testing. Medical testing in the early 1960s was a horror show. Doctors injected radiopaque fluid into his spine, tilting him on a table to watch it move with X-rays. They stuck electrodes into his muscles to measure their electrical activity. And through it all, they spoke over him, not to him, treating him as a mere specimen. When the tests finally stopped, the doctors came in with grim faces. They didn't use the famous name ALS. In the UK, it was called motor neuron disease. The explanation was devastatingly simple: the nerves controlling his muscles were dying, and as they died, his muscles would waste away from lack of use. It would start in his hands and feet, move to his legs and torso, and eventually reach the muscles used for swallowing and breathing. His brain, however, would remain perfectly untouched, fully conscious, fully intelligent, and fully aware, trapped inside a corpse that was slowly shutting down. Stephen asked the inevitable question, what is the prognosis? The answer was a death sentence. 2 years, they said. He would be dead by 23. Discharged with no treatment and no cure, Stephen fell into a deep, black depression. He returned to Cambridge but saw no point in working. Why start a PhD if you'll be dead before finishing it? He locked himself in his room, stopped attending lectures, and spent his days drinking and listening to records. His musical taste shifted to match his mood, becoming obsessed with the tragic, thundering operas of Richard Wagner. He would sit in the dark, the music blasting, simply waiting for the end. During this darkness, Stephen had a nightmare that became a revelation. In the dream, he was standing before a firing squad, about to be executed. In that moment of imagined death, he realized with terrifying clarity that he wanted to live. He woke with a transformative thought: if he were to be reprieved, there were so many things he could do. As he later said, when you are faced with the possibility of an early death, it makes you realize that life is worth living and that there are a lot of things you want to do. But a dream alone wasn't enough to save a life. He needed a tether to the world. That tether had already appeared at a New Year's Eve party, just before his diagnosis was confirmed. Her name was Jane Wilde. She was his opposite in almost every way, a student of modern languages and poetry, deeply religious, with a quiet, steely strength. When she met him, she didn't see a broken man, she saw a brilliant one, captivated by his wit, his strange humor, and his beautiful gray eyes. When Stephen received his 2 years to live diagnosis, he tried to push Jane away, not wanting to burden her. But Jane Wilde was made of tougher stuff. In an era when disabled people were often hidden away, she made a radical decision. She decided that she loved him, and that was enough. She looked at his death sentence and ignored it, telling Stephen she wanted to marry him. This was the turning point, the moment the mind decided to fight the body. The engagement changed everything. Suddenly, Stephen had a problem. As he put it, if I was going to get married, I had to get a job. And if I was going to get a job, I had to finish my PhD. The ticking clock of his illness hadn't stopped, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer a countdown to death, it was a deadline for work. He had to figure out the secrets of the universe, and he had to do it fast. And then, a twist of fate that even the doctors couldn't explain occurred. The 2 years came and went. The disease was progressing, he was now using a cane, and his speech was worsening, but the progression had slowed down. The doctors had been wrong about the timeline. Stephen returned to his research with a ferocity he had never shown before. The lazy genius of Oxford was gone, replaced by a man on fire. He began to attack the biggest problems in physics, thinking about the beginning of time and the Big Bang. He was walking with a stick, his hands were curling into claws, but his mind was sharpening. He was about to challenge the greatest minds in science. He had been given a reprieve. The execution was delayed. And Stephen Hawking was going to make the universe pay for every stolen second. Chapter 3, Reversing Time. In July of 1965, Stephen Hawking did something his doctors had deemed impossible just 2 years earlier. He stood at an altar in a Cambridge church and got married. If you look at the wedding photos from that day, you see a handsome, smiling young man in a sharp suit, who looks like any other groom on the happiest day of his life. But if you look closer, you'll notice he's gripping a cane, and his posture has a slight stiffness, a visible resistance against gravity. He was 23 years old, walking down the aisle towards his new wife, Jane, but physically, he was marching straight into a storm. This moment captures the very last chapter of Stephen Hawking as a walking man, standing on the precipice of 2 lives, the life of his body, which was ending, and the life of his mind, which was just beginning. His marriage to Jane became the fuel he desperately needed. As Stephen later famously said, "I now had something to live for." But marriage also brought a very practical, earthly problem. He was a husband now, with a family to support, which meant he needed a job and an income. To secure a research fellowship at Cambridge, he had to finish his PhD thesis, and he had to do it fast. The clock was still ticking. To make his mark, Stephen decided he couldn't just write a standard paper, he had to pick a fight. And being Stephen Hawking, he aimed for the top, taking on the biggest man on campus. In the mid-1960s, the world of astronomy was ruled by Fred Hoyle, a giant in the field and a scientific celebrity who was the primary defender of the steady-state theory. This was a comforting idea, suggesting the universe had always existed and always would, eternal, unchanging, and safe. To Hoyle, the universe was a perfect, timeless machine. Stephen, the upstart graduate student, looked at the math and disagreed. He found himself drawn to a rival, unpopular idea, the terrifying notion that the universe had exploded into existence out of nothing. Ironically, it was Fred Hoyle himself who had mockingly given this theory its name during a radio interview, calling it the Big Bang. He meant it as an insult, but the name stuck. Stephen believed the Big Bang was real, but belief isn't science. He needed mathematical proof to describe the moment of creation. And he was stuck. The equations weren't working. While Stephen was wrestling with the origin of the universe, his body was fighting its own civil war. The decline was no longer a secret, it was a public spectacle. Writing, the primary tool of any theoretical physicist, became an agonizing chore. His handwriting, always messy, deteriorated into an incoherent scribble. To write his equations, he had to grip the pen with both hands, sweating with effort as he dragged the ink across the page. It was a humiliating struggle. When the pen became impossible, he switched to a typewriter, but even that was a battle. He would sit for hours, pecking out one letter at a time with stiff, uncooperative fingers. Imagine the frustration. His mind was racing at the speed of light, visualizing concepts no human had ever seen, but his physical output was slowed to a crawl. It was like trying to download the entire internet through a dial-up connection. This physical limitation forced Stephen to change how he did physics. While most scientists calculated with pen and paper, Stephen had to retrain his brain to think in geometry. He began to visualize the universe as shapes, expanding, contracting, warping, and bending, building a mental chalkboard in his mind that he could never drop or erase. Then, in 1965, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A brilliant mathematician named Roger Penrose, who would become Stephen's lifelong friend and intellectual rival, was working on the death of stars. Penrose had calculated something terrifying, that when a giant star dies, it collapses under its own gravity, crushing itself into a single point of infinite density where the laws of physics break down and time stops. He called it a singularity. When Stephen read Penrose's work, a light bulb went off. It was a moment of pure, intuitive genius. He looked at the math about dying stars and thought, what if I reversed the film? Imagine a movie of a black hole collapsing into a dot, and then play it backward. Instead of matter crushing down, the point explodes outward, creating matter, space, and time. Stephen realized that singularity wasn't just how stars died, it was how the universe was born. It was the seed of the Big Bang. He began working feverishly on this idea, proving that time itself had a beginning, that the universe wasn't eternal, as Hoyle claimed, but was born. This work became his PhD thesis, Properties of Expanding Universes. When he submitted it in 1966, the scientific community was stunned. The math was elegant, forceful, and brilliant. The 24-year-old with the cane had rewritten the history of creation, proving the universe began in a singularity. He won the prestigious Adams Prize, became a fellow at Caius College, and secured his job, income, and reputation. He had done what he set out to do. But as his academic career skyrocketed, his domestic life faced a new and terrifying reality. In 1967, Jane gave birth to their first son, Robert. Stephen was overjoyed to be a father, but fatherhood is a physical job, and Stephen was losing his physicality. There's a heartbreaking irony here. The man who had just explained the birth of the cosmos struggled to hold his own son. He couldn't easily pick Robert up when he cried or help change diapers, he could only watch. The simple act of moving around Cambridge became a daily gamble with death. The city, with its stairs, cobblestones, and narrow passages, is not designed for the disabled. For years, Stephen refused a wheelchair, viewing it as a final surrender to the disease. He wanted to walk, even if it was torture. He would cling to college walls, dragging his feet, taking 20 minutes to cross a small courtyard. Friends watched, terrified, wanting to help, but Stephen's pride was fierce. He would bark at them to leave him alone. There's a famous story of him climbing the stairs to his office, hauling himself up one agonizing step at a time, pulling his dead weight with his arms. It took him nearly an hour. He was fighting a war of attrition against gravity, the very force he was studying. By the late 1960s, the battle was lost. His balance was gone, and he could no longer walk safely with a cane. He finally accepted the wheelchair. And for most people, this would be a tragedy, but for Stephen Hawking, it was a liberation. Once he sat down, he stopped worrying about falling and could redirect all his precious energy back into physics. And true to his character, he didn't just sit in the chair, he drove it like a maniac. Remember the daredevil coxswain from the Oxford Boat Club? That man was still there. Stephen became a terror on the streets of Cambridge, speeding down pavements, spinning in circles at parties to make himself dizzy. There were even rumors, which he always denied with a wink, that he'd run over the toes of people he didn't like. The wheelchair became his tank, and he was the commander. By 1970, the transformation was complete. The boy who walked into Oxford was gone, the man who sat in the chair had arrived. He had a wife, a child, a fellowship, and he had proven time had a beginning. But now, he turned his eyes to something darker. He had used Penrose's singularities to explain the start of the universe, and now he wanted to study the singularities themselves. He was ready to look at the monsters in the dark. He was ready to look at black holes. And what he would find there would cause the biggest controversy in modern physics. The Black Hole War was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Black Hole War. By the early 1970s, Stephen Hawking was living a life of profound duality. To the outside world, he was a rising star at Cambridge, but behind closed doors, he was fighting a daily battle against his own biology. The year 1974 would define him, the year he started a war with the laws of physics, a war that would forever change our understanding of the universe. To grasp the sheer magnitude of what he did, we first have to understand what the world believed about black holes at that time. The definition was simple, absolute, and terrifying. A black hole was a cosmic vacuum cleaner, a region of space where gravity was so intense that nothing, not even light, could escape its grip. It was a one-way door. Matter went in and nothing came out, erasing stars and light from existence forever. This was the golden rule, backed by Einstein's general theory of relativity and accepted by every major physicist on Earth. A black hole was completely, totally, and eternally black. Stephen Hawking looked at this golden rule and found it annoying. He was searching for a way to unite the two great, warring tribes of physics. On one side was general relativity, which explained the very big, gravity, planets, and stars. On the other was quantum mechanics, which explained the very small, atoms and subatomic particles. These two theories hated each other, speaking different languages. Most physicists stayed in their own lanes to avoid a crash, but Stephen decided to drive right into the middle of the traffic. He wanted to apply the chaotic rules of the quantum world to the massive, smooth surface of a black hole's edge, the boundary known as the event horizon. The breakthrough didn't happen in a lab or at a chalkboard, it happened in the bedroom. One evening, as Stephen was being prepared for bed, an agonizingly slow ritual of struggle against buttons and gravity, the idea struck him. He often said these long, silent struggles were when he did his best work. While his body was being moved like a mannequin, his mind was free to roam the galaxy. That night, he had a vision of what was happening at the very edge of a black hole. He knew that according to quantum theory, empty space isn't really empty. It teems with invisible activity, filled with virtual particles, pairs of particles, one positive and one negative, that constantly pop into existence out of nowhere, snap together, and annihilate each other instantly. It's a constant, microscopic fizz of energy pervading the entire universe. Stephen wondered, what if these particles pop into existence right on the event horizon? He realized that if a pair appeared exactly on that line, something dramatic would happen. Gravity might grab the negative particle and suck it into the black hole before it could destroy its partner. The negative particle would fall in, lost forever, but the positive partner would be stranded. With no partner to annihilate with, it would be forced to become real. To an observer watching from a spaceship, it would look like the particle had just been spat out by the black hole. It would look like the black hole was glowing. This was heresy. It broke every rule in the book. It meant black holes weren't truly black, they were emitting radiation. Stephen couldn't believe it and spent weeks checking his math, trying to find the error, trying to make the radiation go away. But the numbers wouldn't lie. The radiation was real. And then he realized the terrifying implication: if a black hole is emitting radiation, it is losing energy. If it is losing energy, it is losing mass. And if it is losing mass, it is shrinking. Stephen Hawking had discovered that black holes don't live forever. They slowly evaporate, leaking away their mass over billions of years. As they get smaller, they get hotter, until finally, in their last moments, they don't just vanish, they explode with the force of 1,000,000 nuclear bombs. He had discovered what we now call Hawking radiation. When he presented this idea to the scientific community, the reaction was not applause, it was shock, followed by anger. In February 1974, at a packed conference near Oxford, Stephen delivered his paper from his wheelchair. When he finished, there was a stunned silence. The idea was too radical, it contradicted everything they knew. The chairman of the session, Professor John Taylor, stood up and said in front of everyone, "I'm sorry, Stephen, but this is utter rubbish." The room erupted into arguments, but Stephen sat there defiant. He knew he was right, the math was beautiful. It took years for the rest of the world to catch up, but eventually, they did. Stephen Hawking had done the impossible. He had looked into the abyss and found light, a discovery that would cement his name in history alongside Newton and Einstein. But while Stephen was conquering the cosmos, the black hole war had a second front, his own home. By 1974, the physical toll of his condition had reached a breaking point. The man who had just explained how stars explode could no longer hold a spoon. Dining became a trial of dignity, he had to be fed. For a man of immense pride, the loss of such a basic ability was a devastating psychological blow. He was a father, yet as dependent as an infant, a husband, yet his wife Jane had to become his nurse. Jane was incredible, managing the house, raising the children, and caring for Stephen as he became a global celebrity. But the strain was immense. The house was filled with the tension of a man becoming a mind without a body. Yet Stephen never lost his sense of humor, using it as a shield against pity. During this time, another controversy brewed in the sky. Astronomers had found a strange object called Cygnus X-1, heavy, dark, and emitting X-rays. It was the perfect candidate for a real-life black hole, but no one was sure. Stephen, enjoying the chaos, decided to make a bet with his friend, physicist Kip Thorne. In a move that baffled everyone, Stephen bet against himself, wagering that Cygnus X-1 was not a black hole. His logic was a masterclass in psychological protection. He called it an insurance policy. If it turned out to be a black hole, he'd win the scientific victory. If it wasn't, he'd at least win the bet. He would win either way. The stakes revealed his mischievous, rebellious side. If Stephen won, Kip had to buy him a 4-year subscription to the satirical magazine Private Eye. If Kip won, Stephen had to buy him a 1-year subscription to Penthouse. It was a scandalous bet that shocked Cambridge's polite society, but that was the point. It showed the world that the man in the wheelchair wasn't a saint or a tragedy, he was a man who liked jokes, gambling, and refused to be treated with kid gloves. The bet hung on Kip Thorne's office wall for years until the evidence became undeniable. Cygnus X-1 was indeed a black hole. One night, while Kip was in Russia, Stephen quietly broke into his office with some students, found the framed bet, and with great difficulty added his thumbprint to concede defeat. He paid up the subscription. This was the paradox of 1974. It was the year Stephen Hawking became a legend, proving that black holes die and that the universe is far stranger than we imagined. But it was also the year he had to learn to ask for help with the simplest human tasks. He was exploring the event horizon, the point of no return, but in his own life, he had already crossed it. There was no going back to the man he used to be. And just as he was adjusting to this new reality, a shadow appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a black hole. It was something much smaller, but for Stephen, much more dangerous. It was a germ. And it was coming to steal his voice. Chapter 5, Silence and the Machine. By the summer of 1985, Stephen Hawking had achieved a level of fame most scientists only dream of. He was traveling the world, giving lectures, and receiving medals. At 43, he had defied the grim predictions of his youth and was very much alive, having just finished the first draft of a popular science book. But a trip to Geneva, Switzerland, to visit the CERN research facility, would transform from a working visit into a brush with death. It began innocently enough with fatigue, but his already shallow breathing, weakened by years of deteriorating chest muscles, soon became a struggle. Late one night, he began to choke. An ambulance raced through Geneva's streets to a hospital, where Stephen, now blue from lack of oxygen, was diagnosed with a virulent pneumonia. For a man with ALS, whose lungs were already failing, such an infection is often fatal. Stephen slipped into a coma as the infection ravaged his body, his oxygen levels plummeting and his organs beginning to shut down. The Swiss doctors did all they could, but after days of struggle, they reached a grim conclusion. The damage was too severe. They approached Jane, who had rushed to his bedside, and suggested the unthinkable, turning off the life support to let him die peacefully. It would have been the end of the story, the final recapture of the mind that escaped the body. But Jane Hawking refused. She later said she never considered it for a moment, telling the doctors, Stephen must live. She demanded he be flown back to Cambridge, to Addenbrooke's hospital. She wouldn't let him die in a foreign land. The doctors in Cambridge managed to save his life, but the price was terrible. To allow him to breathe, they performed an emergency tracheotomy, cutting a hole in his neck and inserting a breathing tube. The operation saved him from pneumonia, but it took something else. When Stephen finally woke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The tracheotomy had severed his vocal cords. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The slurred, difficult voice he had used for 20 years, the voice that had argued about black holes and proposed to Jane, was gone. He was alive, but he was mute. The despair that followed was deeper than anything since his original diagnosis. Imagine the horror, a man whose entire existence resided in his mind, whose only interaction with the world was through communication, now trapped inside his own skull, a genius locked in a silent room with no door. For weeks, his only means of communication was a painstaking spelling card. A nurse or Jane would point to letters one by one, and Stephen would raise his eyebrows for yes. It took minutes to spell hello, and an hour to form a sentence. Writing papers or having a conversation was impossible. Stephen sank into a depression, feeling his life as a physicist was over, that he had become a burden. But the world was changing in 1985, and the computer revolution offered a lifeline. In California, a computer expert named Walt Wolters, who had developed a program called Equalizer for his mother-in-law after she lost her speech, heard of Stephen's plight and sent the software to Cambridge. A friend, physicist David Mason, adapted the system for a wheelchair, mounting a small computer screen on the chair's arm connected to a gray box underneath. The system was controlled by a single switch, or clicker, that Stephen could hold. He still had a tiny movement in his thumb, that faint twitch was all he needed. A cursor would scan across the screen, moving through rows of letters and common words. When it hit the desired word, Stephen would click his thumb, building sentences word by word. Then, he could send the sentence to the gray box, a speech synthesizer from the early 80s. Sitting in his chair with the new machine humming, Stephen watched the cursor move. He clicked his thumb, built a sentence, and commanded the machine to speak. The sound that emerged was strange, metallic, flat, and bearing a distinctly American, robotic accent. It sounded like a character from a cheap science fiction movie. "Hello. My name is Stephen Hawking." It was jarring, a British professor from Oxford and Cambridge speaking with a Californian robot's voice. But to Stephen, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. For the first time in months, he could speak without a translator. He could make jokes, order dinner, and tell his children he loved them. More importantly, he could write again. The software let him save text, allowing him to compose lectures paragraph by paragraph, save them to a disk, and play them back to an audience. He could write equations once more. The speed was slow, about 15 words per minute, but the clarity was perfect. Where only his family and students had understood his slurred speech before, now everyone could understand him. As he grew accustomed to the machine, something fascinating happened. The voice started to change him. Before, Stephen was a brilliant but frail academic. With the machine, he became a symbol, the iconic image of a man in a wheelchair with a computer screen and a robotic voice, a fusion of biology and technology. When more realistic, human-sounding synthesizers with British accents became available in the 90s, friends suggested he upgrade. Stephen refused. He tried other voices but hated them, saying they lacked character. He had bonded with the robotic American voice, it had become how he heard himself. He famously said, "The voice is a bit robotic, but I stick with it because it has become my trademark." This was the final step in the mind escaping the body. He had built a new voice that would never slur, tire, or age. With this new voice, Stephen was ready to re-enter the world. He had unfinished business. Before the pneumonia, he had started writing a book for the public, explaining the universe. He opened a new file on his computer screen, clicked his thumb, and watched the cursor move as words formed. He was about to write the book that would change his life and make him the most famous scientist since Albert Einstein. He was about to write a brief history of time. The silence was over. The machine was ready to speak to the world. Chapter 6, A Brief History of Fame. By the late 1980s, Stephen Hawking was already a legend within academia. He held the prestigious Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at Cambridge, a seat once occupied by Isaac Newton, and was renowned as the man who had tamed black holes. Yet, outside the university walls, he remained relatively unknown to the general public. That was all about to change. The catalyst wasn't a new scientific breakthrough, but a very practical, human problem: money. His scientific fame didn't come with a large paycheck, and he had a wife, 3 growing children, and an extraordinarily expensive medical condition to support. He was particularly worried about school fees for his daughter, Lucy. He needed a hit, not another textbook for graduate students, but a book for the public, one you'd find in airport bookstores. He proposed the idea to a literary agent under the poetic title A Brief History of Time. The agent warned him that physics books rarely sold well, being too dry and complex. But Stephen was stubborn. He wanted to explain the universe's biggest questions, where it came from and how it would end, without requiring a PhD to understand. The writing process itself was an act of supreme endurance. This was just after his tracheotomy, so he was composing every word using his new computer system, clicking his thumb to select words at a painstaking rate of 10 to 15 per minute. Every sentence was a marathon, every paragraph, a mountain climb. When the first draft reached his editor at Bantam Books, the response was blunt: it was unreadable and needed a complete rewrite. Rather than taking offense, Stephen accepted the challenge. He realized that to reach the masses, he had to stop thinking like a mathematician and start thinking like a storyteller. He cut nearly all the equations, famously adhering to his editor's advice that each equation would have the readership. In the end, he included only one: E equals mc squared. Published on April Fool's Day, 1988, the book exploded beyond all expectations. The first print run sold out in days. A Brief History of Time shot to the top of bestseller lists in Britain and America, remaining on the Sunday Times list for a staggering 237 weeks, over 4 years. It entered the record books, was translated into 40 languages, and sold over 10 million copies. Suddenly, the man in the wheelchair was not just a physicist but a global pop culture phenomenon. Why did such a dense book resonate with millions? Part of it was the poetic title, promising secret knowledge. But a huge part was Stephen himself. The public was captivated by the magnetic contrast. Here was the most physically confined man on Earth, who couldn't move or speak, yet his mind roamed the infinite freedom of the cosmos. People didn't just buy the book to learn physics, they bought it as a talisman. It became the most unread bestseller of all time, a status symbol placed proudly on coffee tables. The idea of Stephen Hawking had captured the world's imagination. And Stephen loved it. He wasn't a reclusive genius, he basked in the spotlight, becoming an oracle whom people asked about God, the meaning of life, and humanity's future. He famously ended the book with a line that bridged science and faith, that a complete theory of the universe would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we should know the mind of God. That single sentence cemented his superstardom. He appeared on The Simpsons, shared the screen with Newton and Einstein on Star Trek, and was sampled on Pink Floyd albums. His robotic voice became as iconic as the Queen's English. But while Stephen conquered the world, his own world in Cambridge was fracturing. Fame is a dangerous drug with severe side effects. The book's success brought wealth and attention, but it destroyed the fragile ecosystem of the Hawking household. For 25 years, Jane had been the pillar, lifting, feeding, and caring for him while raising their children. Their marriage was built on a complex dependency, she was his protector. Now, Stephen didn't need a protector, he had an entourage. The book's money funded a team of professional nurses for 24-hour care, a necessity for his survival but fatal for his marriage. The family home transformed into a busy hospital ward, filled with strangers, nurses, assistants, media crews. Jane later described feeling like a squatter in her own home, pushed to the margins, her privacy and central role stripped away. Intoxicated by celebrity, Stephen began to change. The nurses treated him like a rock star, flattering him and laughing at his jokes, while Jane still saw the stubborn, demanding husband. The gap between them widened into a canyon. The tension crystallized around one person, Elaine Mason, a vibrant, red-headed nurse who was the wife of David Mason, the engineer who had adapted Stephen's computer. Elaine gave him the adoration a physically helpless man might crave, telling him he was wonderful. The atmosphere turned toxic. The children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim, watched as their parents drifted apart. Jane found solace in her church choir, forming a close platonic bond with a musician named Jonathan Hellier-Jones. Though Stephen accepted this, the emotional distance became unbridgeable. In 1990, the inevitable climax arrived. Stephen told Jane he was leaving her for Elaine. After 25 years of battling death together and raising a family against impossible odds, the partnership was over. Stephen moved out to a flat with Elaine. The media frenzy was immediate, the saint of science was leaving his devoted wife. But for Stephen, this was another act of defiance, an assertion of his right to a life as messy and flawed as any able-bodied person's. He didn't want to be a saint, he wanted to be a man with desires. The cost, however, was profound. The divorce caused a rift with his children that took years to heal, and many old friends and colleagues were horrified, feeling he had abandoned the woman who had kept him alive. So, as the 1990s dawned, Stephen Hawking stood at the peak of his professional power. He was the most famous scientist in history, with wealth, presidential access, and public adoration. But he had lost his anchor. He had cast off the safety net that had caught him at 21 and was now flying solo, carried only by the wings of his own fame. The universe was his. But the home he had built was empty. Chapter 7, The Final Theory. As the 1990s dissolved into the new millennium, Stephen Hawking occupied a space no scientist ever had before. He had transcended academia and even non-fiction to become a permanent character in humanity's global story. Unlike the distant, stern figures of Einstein or Newton in old photographs, Stephen was in your living room. He was everywhere. He appeared on The Simpsons, saving Springfield with his rocket wheelchair and telling Homer Simpson, "I wanted to see your utopia, but now I see it is more of a fruitopia." He lent his synthesized voice to Pink Floyd's track, Keep Talking, and even starred in a Monty Python skit, humorously running over his fellow physicists with his wheelchair. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of his pop culture reign was his appearance on Star Trek: The Next Generation. In a scene where the android Data plays poker with holograms of history's greatest minds, Sir Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, Stephen insisted on playing himself. Flown to the set in California, he was lifted from his wheelchair and placed in the captain's chair of the Enterprise during a break, touching the controls of the warp drive with a smile. It was a playful yet profound moment, a man whose body was bound to Earth, but whose spirit belonged on a starship. He was the only living person at that poker table, playing cards with ghosts, yet he was the one who felt eternal. But while the public saw the icon, the man himself was entering a final, reflective phase. In the mid-2000s, his second marriage to Elaine Mason ended in divorce, a tumultuous period that had estranged him from his family. Yet from this came a beautiful reconciliation. Stephen reconnected with his first wife, Jane, and his 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim, becoming a grandfather and slowly regluing the family unit that fame and illness had shattered. With his family beside him, Stephen decided to do something reckless. He wanted to go to space. He knew he couldn't endure a rocket launch to the Moon or Mars, but he could get close. In 2007, at 65, he traveled to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida to board the Vomit Comet, a modified Boeing 727 that flies parabolic arcs to create weightlessness. The medical risks were enormous: his weak heart, his tracheotomy tube, his total lack of muscle control. Doctors feared the G-forces could stop his heart or that he would choke in zero gravity. But Stephen didn't care. He wanted to fly. On April 26, as the plane nosed over into its dive, gravity vanished. For the first time in 44 years, Stephen Hawking was not disabled. Nurses lifted him gently from his seat, and he floated at the cabin center, an apple drifting beside him in a nod to Newton. In the footage, you see him spinning slowly, his paralyzed limbs adrift, his mouth wide open in a grin of pure, childlike ecstasy. After the flight, back in his wheelchair under Earth's gravity, he told the press, "Space, here I come," and added, "For a few minutes, I was Superman." It was the ultimate victory of his will. The man most crushed by gravity had finally beaten it. Moving into his 70s, Stephen became a global grandfather. He shifted from just explaining the universe to worrying about its inhabitants, using his platform to issue urgent warnings. He cautioned against the unchecked rise of artificial intelligence, fearing machines that could outsmart us. He pleaded for action on climate change and argued that humanity must eventually colonize other planets to survive. Some called him a pessimist, but he was a futurist, a believer in human potential who was terrified we would squander our rare, fragile place in the cosmos. He worked until the very end, publishing papers on black holes and wrestling with the information paradox he had discovered decades earlier. His mind remained sharp, even as his communication slowed to a word per minute. Then, the final singularity arrived. On March 14, 2018, Stephen Hawking passed away peacefully at his home in Cambridge. The date held a poetic symmetry, 3.14, Pi Day, and also the birthday of Albert Einstein. He was born on the anniversary of Galileo's death and died on Einstein's birth, as if the universe itself had woven him into the fabric of scientific history. The reaction was instant and global. Flags flew at half-mast, and tributes flooded in from scientists, presidents, rock stars, astronauts, and the casts of The Big Bang Theory and The Simpsons. His ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey, between Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. So, what is the final theory of Stephen Hawking? What is his true legacy? It isn't just Hawking radiation or theorems on singularities, those are for the textbooks. His real legacy is a demonstration of pure possibility. Stephen Hawking was a glitch in medical reality. A man who should have died in 1965, who should have been silenced, who should have been forgotten in a hospital ward. Instead, he forced the world to listen. He made us see a master of the universe in a wheelchair and compelled us to look up at the stars instead of down at our feet. He proved that the human mind is not limited by its vessel. He showed that even if you cannot move a muscle, you can travel to the beginning of time, crack jokes, fall in love, and change the world. In the end, his body failed him, as all bodies do. But his mind never surrendered. It broke free of the chair, the atmosphere, and mortality itself. Stephen Hawking has left the building. But his echo will ring across the universe for as long as there are stars to watch. This has been the mind that escaped the body, the Stephen Hawking story. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the cosmos and the incredible life of Stephen Hawking here on EchoLib. We hope this story inspired you to look up at the stars and perhaps see your own challenges in a new light. We would love to hear from you. How did Stephen's story make you feel? Did you find his resilience inspiring? And most importantly, whose life story would you like us to tell next? Let us know in the comments down below. We read every single one. If you enjoyed exploring the mind of Hawking, there is another story you absolutely need to hear. It is the story of the man whose work made Hawking's discoveries possible, the man whose birthday Stephen died on. Click the video appearing on your screen right now to listen to the detailed biography of Albert Einstein. I'll see you there.